welcome to another exclusive Protein Production Technology International interview, this time focusing on the topic of intellectual property. Now, just like any other innovative field, alternative proteins rely on research and development to constantly improve and create new products. Strong IP protections, like patents, allow companies to safeguard their inventions. The alternative protein market is rapidly growing and becoming increasingly competitive. Strong IP portfolios with patents on things like specific manufacturing processes or unique protein strains can give a company a significant edge. So to discuss this and more further, I'm really pleased to have a couple of experts with us to delve deeper. Welcome Chris Hamer, he's a partner, and welcome Laura Clews, she's managing associate, and they're both from Mathys and Squire. So who's going to answer this first question? How involved is your company in the field of food tech?
I think Mathys and Squire has been very involved in with companies in the food and drink industry for a number of years. We've even got a dedicated food group. So we work with different companies relating to the end products, whether that's a food or drink, individual ingredients if they've got a particular benefit, things like improved processes. So maybe it's more cost effective or more environmentally friendly. And we work with companies who relate to the food and drink industry. So maybe companies have produced a more environmentally friendly packaging, which can be used, or biodegradable adhesives or inks and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah, really interesting growth area, to be honest, over the last 2 decades. When I started in the profession, the height of food technology was a Walls Viennetta. And since then, it has now developed into being really true science and innovation, sort of driving forward its own technological space.
Uh-huh. What have your personal observations of the alternative proteins field been over the past, decade, I guess?
It's quite interesting in that in the food space, you'll see a new technology, a new field come, and you'll see the rapid development of that. And so if you were to look at plant-based protein, peptide, that sort of thing, way back, say, in the early 2000s, there were maybe only 100 patents, 150 patents that you could find if you were searching. And now if you do a search, you can get close to 2,000 or more, all in that dedicated area. And so, in such a short period of time, the development's been rapid. It's been relatively quick. And what you see as well is you actually get to see which countries are interested in the development of the technology. And so if you do a quick cut up of all these sort of patents that are out there, you'll find that China's leading the way. And perhaps that's not entirely surprising with some of their issues with, swine flu and bird flu, and thinking about how they're going to feed such a large population. And then you'll see the usual players in the marketplace. You see the US and Europe lagging some ways behind in numbers, but certainly not in investment.
Mm-hmm. Laura, did you have anything to add to that?
I think just picking up on something Chris said earlier, what I've noticed over the last decade and what has been particularly interesting for me is when I first started in the food and drink technology, is what you're looking at. These companies are constantly improving the products that they make, and they may be looking at reducing sugar, reducing fat, particular things that consumers want to see in their products. But what is interesting is what consumers want at the moment is something completely different. It has completely changed what the food products are. So you're now seeing it's not necessarily small improvements on food products. You're seeing completely new areas of technology. And that's really interesting for us. So as an example, there have always been burgers produced for vegetarians, but now the focus is on how do I make a vegetarian or vegan friendly burger, which is designed specifically for meat eaters. So that's something completely different now.
Mm-hmm. Does that change the patent in any way, that you're designing it for a different market?
I think it's more the technology itself, which is different. I think the process is relatively the same.
Right. Now, it's a complex area, technically speaking, and so is IP. So what are some of those IP complexities to consider if you're a startup involved in alternative proteins?
I think one of the main things to consider, particularly when you're starting out, is what IP rights do other companies have. So the research and development of a new product or a new process takes a lot of time and can take a lot of investment. And what you don't want, especially if you're a startup, is to get to the end of that process and have your final product and realise that you might be infringing somebody else's rights. Mm-hmm. So if you can, particularly at the beginning, get an idea of what other people's intellectual property rights are, and if possible, monitor that over the period, because it's much easier at the beginning of a process to do slight tweaks to make sure that you're not infringing anybody else's rights. Whereas if you've come to the end of the process and put in all that time and investment, it's very difficult to then change at the end of the process. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that you may want to look at if you're thinking about IP rights is what information is currently out there. So start looking at scientific journals or podcasts like this, or and articles in general, so you can identify what the inventive part of your product or process is, and you can start thinking about what is that difference and what effect does that have. So you've got a good idea of what benefits that your product provides. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we'd always say, and if you are thinking about IP rights, make sure you keep all information confidential until you file your patent application. That's always important. I think constantly having an eye on what processes you're doing and what research you're doing and how that relates to the overall business strategy, to try and keep focused on where you want to go and where your strengths are, rather than veering off into what might be very interesting but non-profitable tangents of research.
Chris?
Yeah, all very good advice. I think what people underestimate with IP is the speed at which you have to make decisions and the overall cost it will have on your business. I think sort of at least a decade ago, and it's gotten better, to be honest, but people used to think if I have a patent, I'll make money. It doesn't make you any money. You have to take that and you have to find a way to monetize it. And I think the difficulty people then have is they see the possible IP rights they can have. And IP rights are national. And that's, again, something that people don't always realize. So if you have a patent for the UK, that only gives you patent protection in the UK. It doesn't give you patent protection in the US or China or Japan. And you come to a decision where you have to decide where you want to be. And what people see is I'm giving up the potential to make money. And where Laura's really hit the nail on the head is you need to look at your business plan and you need to decide early, how am I going to monetize that IP? And, maybe the answer is, for my business, I will focus on Europe and I will license my IP into the US to another company that has pockets that are able to actually take the project forward or want to work with me. And, those decisions come 2 years into your sort of IP life cycle. And a lot of businesses don't realize you need to be thinking about it early, planning for it, and be happy with those decisions. Because you can't conquer everything. And if you can realize that, I think it becomes a lot less stressful, the sort of entire IP process and how it fits into your business.
And of course, IP is always a major consideration for any companies potentially investing in your startup. So obviously that highlights that. Now, IP, just like regulations, you said there, it's an international thing, but every country has their own rules, regulations. Obviously, you would say that companies starting out in this sector, they're probably best off getting professional advice from a dedicated IP consultancy firm rather than winging it. Do you see any? Have you heard of any errors on the part of companies in this field?
I think not necessarily specifically in this field, but when you grow up in the profession, there are lots of urban myths and anecdotes of attorneys or companies that have made silly mistakes that have really cost them, billions and the potential to conquer the market. It is worth taking early advice. And I think the early advice has two useful things. One, it gives you the structure as to what you're letting yourself in for. You can get your initial patent, but you need to understand the stages, the costs, and if nothing else, it makes you think about these things, about how you want to develop your IP and how you're going to develop your business strategy and how you're going to use your budgets. And so I think that process with an attorney like myself or a Laura is very helpful, even if you do not do all of the things you can do, because it allows you to understand the options and to create the business plan that best suits you.
Yeah, that kind of leads me on to my next question, Laura. The alternative protein space is constantly evolving. So what's the ideal strategic approach when it comes to IP to keep pace with the competition? I mean, it's supposed to be a very collaborative industry, everyone's friends, but ultimately there are also competitors.
I think that's right. So I think part of the answer would be that you need to, as Chris was saying, constantly review where you are in your process and how that relates to your business strategy. What are the key parts of intellectual property which I might want to protect? Is there anything else that we've developed which me personally might not want to protect but could be licensed and provide potential revenue in that way? And we do see companies that do collaborative processes.
Sometimes the answer is drop your IP, to be honest, Nick. There are times where you get to a company and they come to you and you say, this is our IP portfolio. And you say to them, okay, how much of this are you actually using now? Have you gone beyond your initial IP? And is it the time to leave that behind and move on to your next generation? IP is quite holistic, I think. And I don't like the word, but it is sort of a living part of your business. And so you do need to move on at times and realize that you've outgrown your initial research or your initial technologies and invest the money that you could spend on getting some of your old IP through to grant, actually taking that money and putting it into your new IP. So it is quite a constant process, as Laura says, and you do really need to be aware of where you are. But just going back to your question about competitors and friends, it's quite interesting in a way when you look at just IP in general. Investors want a return on their money. It's very few investors that do it just for the good of mankind. They want to see a return. And so the IP has a purpose for them. But roadblocks from IP aren't necessarily bad because they encourage you to look at different avenues to solve the same problem or to develop alternative technologies. And some of the alternatives are better. And so actually it can be healthy to have this sort of competitive space where people are thinking of different ways of achieving the same problem or different solutions to the same problem that everybody has.
Well, before we come on to some of the more specific challenges, we're going to look at some broader implications. Could strong IP rights for alternative proteins stifle competition and hinder the technology's potential to address some of those bigger picture concerns?
Sorry. Personally, I don't think it does. As Chris says, the presence of competition and gaining, your market share and things like that actually pushes the development of the technology further. People are always trying to find the cheaper process, the more efficient process, the better product. Does it? I mean, if you're looking at proteins and cell culture meat, at the moment, the main issues are all relating to price and the mouthfeel and the taste and things like that. So people are constantly, because of the competition and the potential revenue within that sector, are constantly striving to further their products and further their development. And I think in terms of securing or seeing a return on your financial investment into all the costs of the research, employing, people to do the research, you've got your starting materials, you've got your equipment, your space and things like that. Companies tend to have two options really with respect to protecting their intellectual property. You have the option of keeping it as a trade secret. So essentially, as it says on the tin, keeping all the information confidential. That has some downsides because it doesn't protect against another company if they organically come and produce the same product or come up with the same process, and it doesn't protect against reverse engineering. The downside with respect to developing the technology is because you're keeping all that information confidential, it doesn't increase the pool of knowledge, if you like, within that sector. And the more knowledge that people have, the more likely they are to make new connections. And it can be cross-sector. It might be, one invention relates to cell culture meat, the other one might be purely relating to soy proteins, but there's a connection between it that somebody could make only because that information is publicly available, which is why I think sometimes patent rights does help move that technology forward, because to have that monopoly right for a certain period of time, what you need to do is you have to disclose what your invention is, and then you're increasing the pool of knowledge, and that furthers the technology in and of itself.
Is there any way that the current intellectual property system could it be adapted to incentivize innovation in alt proteins while also potentially promoting accessibility and affordability for customers?
I think at the moment, in particular in the UK, there is a lot of incentives to work in the fields of alternative proteins and a lot of support for this kind of research. So at the moment, there are a lot of government grants relating to alternative proteins. Last year, I think it was specifically to developing alternative proteins. This year, it seems to be more relating to producing fermentation products, which again relates to proteins. So I think there is a lot of assistance available to startups in funding this research. There are also a number of schemes which help companies obtain intellectual property rights. To give one example, you've got Innovate UK. So they offer schemes which provide funding for IP audits. So it's helping companies look at what IP rights they have, how beneficial they may be for the company, what IP rights may they want to secure for their products or for investment. And then there are further grants to actually put any advice from the IP audit into practice. Now, it doesn't normally cover all the costs, but it does help with some of them, which especially for startups where funding might be limited and you have a lot of things to invest money in, any help I think can be beneficial. Now, looking at the European Patent Office, as of the 1st of April this year, I think they've actually implemented a new scheme for micro-entities. So if you're a micro-entity and you have filed less than 5 patent applications in the last 5 years, you can get 30% fee reduction for filing and examination fees, which again is a big help to new companies and helps to encourage smaller companies to actually start looking at their IP rights. And I think Chris would agree, one of the things that you notice most when you talk about new companies is what do I actually want to protect and how do I go about it, which I think is totally understandable. If you haven't come across IP and you don't work in IP, you don't necessarily know what type of intellectual property you need, what part of this invention might be the best for my company or for gaining investment. So one thing that companies tend to do, including Mathys and Squire, is we give free consultations just to sit people down and say, look, these are your options. This is where, looking at the process and the product and what you've been able to tell us is the information out there. This is where I think you should focus your efforts on obtaining intellectual property. And as Chris said earlier, there can be the thought that sometimes you have to protect everything in every territory you possibly can, and then those costs very, very quickly mount up when some of the products or the processes, if you're not moving forward with them or if you're not thinking 20 years in advance, what am I going to be making? How do I want to develop what I'm doing already? That might not really give you a return on that investment. So I think those are the main areas which I feel like there is a lot of support for startup companies.
How might IP considerations impact the development of open source platforms for sharing knowledge and resources in this sector?
I met
I
Chris figure
think
this out.
I think there's a balance. I think there's a balance between wanting to drive innovation forward, but also wanting to ensure that you get the investment into the innovation in order to actually drive the sector forward. And as I said to you earlier, investors generally want to get something out of it. And where I sort of think Laura has it right is she said, if you file a patent application, there is a publication after 18 months. And what that does is it actually creates a pointer to where certain businesses are putting in their research and where they're looking at solving the solution. And I think those pointers in their own way form an open source grouping of information to give you an idea of what people are thinking about as the solutions to a problem. What you do see is cross-licensing between businesses sometimes. So, I could see an instance where if one company fixes the protein side of things and they've got it perfect, but they can't get the fat part right. And this is an interesting issue you've seen in a lot of these products. People don't want to buy a lump of what looks like meat because meat to them has sinew and it has fat in it. And if you don't have the sinew and you don't have the fat, it doesn't look right. And so consumers want their products to still look right. They want to go to a shelf and pick up something that to them ticks all the boxes of this is meat. Maybe they don't have the solution to the fat problem, but somebody else has worked out how to generate the fat component. And those two businesses really need to start talking to each other because together they've probably got the solution that will take the marketplace, but individually they're both lacking in some feature to make that conquering step. And so IP can actually facilitate some of those things by being able to comfortably find a way to publish with protection what they've been able to achieve. It can allow the businesses to come together and come up with a solution. And if you look, for instance, at plant-based foods and plant-based meats and protein meats and everything, there are many, many companies all trying to figure out how to make fake fat. Because everybody wants to bite into something and they want it to be juicy and they want it to look right when it's raw and they want it to disappear when it's cooked. And those are all driven by consumers wanting to have the real thing. And so what's interesting with IP, for instance, is if you look at the fat issue, one of the early solutions was let's use coconut fat. And the problem with that is as soon as you stick it in a hot frying pan, it wets out and it looks all sloppy. Well, nobody wants that. And then there was talk about whether you can use palm oil, but now palm oil has a bad name socially. So people don't want you to use palm oil, even if it's been, grown and produced in the right way. So there's a push there to find a different alternative. And if you look in pans, they're now using things like inulin and fruit fibers as a way of trying to bind some of these materials to make them last enough that when you have it in a packet, it looks like fat. And when you cook with it, it gradually disappears. And that is sort of an interesting aspect, I think, of the development of IP and the need of businesses to talk to each other in the sector. Because at the end of the day, and this is something we see a lot of with companies, when you say, how is this product doing? They'll talk about consumer take-up. And at the end of the day, consumers are still king. And most consumers will not eat something which they might perceive as healthier or more ethical if it doesn't remind them of what it is they want to eat in the first place.
Mm-hmm. We're going to move on to some of those specific challenges now. So with plant-based proteins, often, as you discussed just there, mimicking the taste and texture of their animal counterparts, how can IP law distinguish between innovative creation and just mere imitation?
So if you don't mind, I'll start on this one and I'll let Laura cut in. A lot of the time, what we do is driven by clients coming to us and saying there's a problem in the marketplace. And a lot of them are actually driven by consumer demand or consumer complaints. And this is the same from startups all the way through to multinationals. They'll come and they'll say, this is the problem. And you'll say, well, why is it a problem? And they'll explain it to you. what companies are doing and where the IP comes in is trying to come up with a technical solution to that problem. So it might be the meat goes gray under storage. Nobody wants to buy gray meat. And so we're not always necessarily patenting the process or the steps by which you make an entire meat product. Our goal on the IP might be to protect the way in which they're preventing the color change in the product when it's in the packet, so that it stays looking like the product that people want to buy. And it's fascinating because there are always problems, and there are always technological solutions. And when I spoke at the beginning about patents going from a few hundred to thousands, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing people with the initial concept, this is my ability to make a protein. This is my ability to make protein and maybe make it look something like meat. This is my ability to put it on a scaffold. And they're going through those steps. And all those steps are really driven by the ability to convince consumers to mass produce, to be able to make it volume, to be able to make it within a reasonable price bracket. Everybody's having to constantly innovate to try and get it closer and closer to the real thing, whilst also, being able to do it for a reasonable price. Mm-hmm. You can have a perfect meat-based product, but if it costs you £1,000, nobody's going to buy it, unfortunately.
No. Laura, did you have
I
anything
think one of the areas which I personally find fascinating in the whole cell culture meat movement is where people are trying to imitate natural meat. I mean, one of the big things in this area is people can produce what looks like processed meat, so mince, but having cells grow in the shape of a fibre for non-processed meat, so a steak, say, to have them grow in that ordered fibre is incredibly difficult. And the innovation that you see that people come up with just trying to create this structure is, I find, fascinating because it's so different. And I think that's one of the things that make our job so lovely, is to see the creativity that humans have. So you have people decellularizing plants, so they have that scaffold so it can come up in this very specific way. You have wet electroprocessing, and people are building their equipment out of Lego. You have people growing meat on blades of grass. You've got genetically modified blue algae because it produces it in this more fibrous texture. And I think that where people are trying to imitate something that you would get naturally is actually where a lot of the creativity is, and everything surrounding that. And I think in this area, and as we mentioned at the beginning, it's a totally new area of technology. So everything involves all of the steps, how you select your starting products, how you grow the cells, how you get them in a specific structure, how you mold them, what ingredients to combine with it, as Chris was saying, to create the fats and things like that. Everything is new, everything is being developed now. And I think trying to create something that is very close to meat, because that's what the consumers want. They want it to taste and look and smell like meat, obviously at a reasonable price. I think that's where a lot of the creativity is, and it's probably one of the more exciting areas of this technology.
Mm-hmm. This is probably a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How is it that multiple companies are able to patent their process for growing meat in labs? Why is I think it was probably Willem van Eelen was the first to file a patent for in vitro production of meat. But how is it so many companies are able to file their own patents? Is it the specific nuances with the way they do it, or?
So it'll be a lot of it is to do with how, or the multiple steps that are involved in actually growing the meat. So what is the starting product that you'll use? How are you obtaining those cells? What is the nutrient you're using to grow those cells? And that nutrient that you use will probably differ depending on the type of cells that you start with. And the nutrient that you use won't be one component. So how do you optimize all those different components to get the best result possible? Then once you have your cells, you need to think about, okay, how am I going to form them into a particular product? And then you look at all the scaffolding, or am I doing a molding process? How do I extrude that? When you're looking at the extrusion process, you have to think about water content and heat and pressure, and how do you optimize all of those things to produce the best product that you can. And it's all of those different steps, all of that research that actually differs and creates a new product and creates a new process. And that's where the invention lies.
Mm-hmm. I think patents get a bad name sometimes, and they're not always as broad as people would have you believe when you read them. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time, it's far more narrow than you might realize, and actually, it can be incremental. Some of these patents, they might be an improvement on an already known system, so they're not necessarily stretching out and blocking huge areas. They're just looking at greater efficiency or better cell growth or more consistent cell growth, or all those things that you're trying to keep on improving as you sort of develop your product.
Mm-hmm. How can IP rights be applied to these cell cultured meat products, considering that the biological source materials involved?
Well, as we've just been discussing, there's a lot of different areas that there's a lot of different process steps relating to actually producing cell cultured meat. So there are the nutrients that you use, what type of ingredients do you involve, what particular ratios are those nutrients in, all the process parameters that you use to produce cell cultured meat, how do you grow those cells in particular. So there are lots of different parts of the process which can be protected using intellectual property that don't relate to the cells themselves.
Uh-huh. I've just got a couple of more questions now. As companies, and we haven't talked about this particular field yet, but as companies start developing GMOs, genetically modified organisms, for alternative proteins, what are the unique IP challenges associated with patenting living things?
Many and many more potentially. So it's IP law struggles to keep up to date with the changes that are going on scientifically, and that's not just in living things. That's AI. That's everything else. And I think what you tend to see is that at some point there's a tipping point, and there was one to do with broccoli and tomatoes, and they were being patented at the European Patent Office, and there was a huge, hoo-ha, and it was preventing people from being able to have their daily meals. And in the US, it was they're patenting life. How can you patent life? And the Supreme Court came in and said you can't. As a result of that, the case law became very strict about anything which is biological or has a relationship to biological technologies. I don't really think that's what IP has ever been seeking to do or what it does. What it tries to do is create a framework for development and investment and pushing things forward. So I think as a practitioner, what you want to see is a system which acknowledges the fairness in allowing innovators, true innovators, to seek some form of return on that investment, on that development, without reaching the stage where they get a monopoly that is so great that it prevents, in theory, others from being able to work in that field. And I think there's a bit of work to be done, to be honest, with the statute and on a national level to make that the right balance that we currently need to have.
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned earlier that this appears to be, on the face of it, a friendly select sector, lots of collaboration, but there are cases ongoing in the industry. Are there any case studies that you can think of that highlight the importance of IP in this sector? There's obviously one famous one.
Well, the one that springs to mind, probably for me, relating to proteins, is Impossible Foods and Motif Foodworks. If you'd like me to talk a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
So Impossible Foods, I think famous for their burger having it bleeds and it smells more like meat and has more of a meaty taste, and this relates to a hemoprotein that they have added into their alternative meat products. So they have patents relating to the use of these heme proteins both in the US and in Europe. And there has been some dispute with Mathys Foodworks recently. So they are producing heme protein as well. And they are also producing burgers which contain this heme protein. So Impossible Foods brought an infringement proceedings against Mathys Foodworks, and which is not surprising. We see a lot. Mathys Foodworks immediately claimed that their patents were invalid. So in the US at the moment, I think everybody's looking to see how this turns out. In the US at the moment, they're still looking at the validity of those patent applications, those patents, sorry. In Europe, the Impossible Food patent has been revoked, and Impossible Foods is now appealing that decision. So everybody's waiting to see what happens on appeal. But I think why this is an important case to talk about is right at the beginning, when you were talking about what should startup companies think about. I think this case highlights the importance of knowing really early on of what IP rights do other people have. What can I do to make sure I really steer clear on one side, but also on the other, the importance of knowing what is already publicly available, because that is Mathys Foodworks' whole argument, is that it was already known before the filing date of their applications to use heme proteins in food substitute products to obtain this effect. So I think it really highlights the importance of doing research really early on and trying to keep on top of developments as you're doing your research and your developments, to make sure that you don't fall foul of any infringement proceedings or potentially having your patent revoked, because these processes again are very expensive, and you want to make sure that if you can possibly have smooth sailing, that's always the way to go.
Yeah. How do you think that will pan out, that particular case?
I don't know if I want to. I want to make a specific prediction. I think we'll follow it and see what the outcome is, and we will learn from that, and inform our clients to let them know what the outcome is and what you can learn from that decision, which is all you can do really as the law develops.
Yeah, indeed. It could be very
in some ways, ironically, they may have achieved their goal with their IP, because if it stops their competitors for long enough, it gives them market share. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting to know what their strategy was when they filed the IP and what they knew. And likewise, in terms of, somebody launching a competing product, they may well have looked at those patents and decided they were weak. And they've also made a commercial decision that they will launch and go ahead because they think ultimately they can revoke the patents. And so going back to one of your earlier questions, just because you have a patent doesn't mean you've managed to corner the market. It's just a tool, a business tool, if you like, to try and give yourself a competitive edge. And how long your competitive edge will last will depend on how strong your patent is.
I mean, that's the high-profile case. As far as I'm aware, there's not that many more ongoing cases. But as this market obviously kicks off, lifts off, I would imagine there will be more proceedings in the offing.
Yeah, I think you're right. Especially if if they get true ability to market the products. There's a lot of questions about how do you look at quality, how do you control quality, how do you ensure that the public are getting safe products. But I think as those issues are ticked off and as the technology becomes more mature, I think you're right. I think that some of the competitiveness will increase and we'll see more of these cases happening.
I think as well, I mean, I know it's a strange thing to say because we're talking about developments over the last decade, but because this is a relatively new sector and it's been predicted to have so much potential profit, you will see people more likely to enforce their IP rights because there is so much more value. when you have a market sector that is potentially so large and still expanding, to make sure they keep their market share.
Well, it's good for us in terms of news stories. Look, Laura, Chris, thank you very much for joining me. It's been fascinating to delve a little deeper into this topic. It's very, very important for these companies, as you say, to make sure that they're not infringing anybody else's rights, but if they've come up with an invention, to make sure nobody else infringes it. So I think it's best off they get some expert guidance from the start, just as with regulations. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully see you soon.